New York never really slept, but on certain nights, it held its breath. And when the city held its breath, it was usually because a man like Lucky Luciano was about to exhale. The city always had a hum to it, a rhythm that never stopped. Even in the dead of night, when the honest folks were asleep, New York breathed heavy with the restless stir of its underworld. Steam hissed from manholes, trolley bells rang faint in the distance, and from behind shaded windows came whispers, deals and promises made in hushed tones. To a kid walking the streets of the Lower East Side in the early 1900s, that sound was either a lullaby or a warning. For Salvatore Lucania, the boy who would one day become Lucky Luciano, it was both. The neighborhood was alive, but not in the way polite society imagined. It wasn't elegant dinners or polite conversations over wine. No, these streets told a different story. The air smelled of sweat and coal dust. Tenements leaned against each other like tired men. You could hear arguments in Italian spilling out of one window, Yiddish prayers from the next, Irish curses from the bar down the block. Poverty didn't discriminate, it wrapped its arms around every immigrant family, squeezing until there was nothing left but hunger and desperation. And in the cracks of that desperation? That's where crime grew. Lucky was just another face in the crowd back then, a boy no older than 10, slipping between pushcarts, learning the rhythm of the streets. But he had eyes sharp as razors, watching every hustle, every exchange. He learned quick, respect wasn't given in this part of town. You had to take it. And to take it, you needed two things: brains and brass. Lucky had both. Some nights, he'd lean against a lamppost, watching older boys run errands for men in sharp suits. Their shoes shined, their voices low, their pockets heavy with cash. These weren't the ragged fathers breaking their backs in sweatshops or digging ditches for pennies. No, these were men who commanded the sidewalk, who could silence a block with just a look. To a young Luciano, that silence wasn't frightening, it was magnetic. It whispered promises of escape from poverty, promises of power, and promises of never bowing your head to anyone again. The streets didn't just feed his hunger, they trained him. The fights in the alleys, the card games played on overturned crates, the deals made in broken English, all of it was a classroom, and Lucky was an attentive student. He saw how violence earned fear, but charm earned loyalty. He noticed how the men who survived weren't the loudest or the strongest, they were the ones who smiled while keeping a blade in their pocket. And so, Luciano practiced that smile. Calm, easy, disarming. The kind of smile that said, "Trust me, friend," while hiding the calculation behind it. Even as a boy, he carried himself with an air that seemed too old for his years. The other kids on Mulberry Street followed him not because he demanded it, but because he made them believe he knew where he was going. But nights on the Lower East Side weren't only lessons in ambition. They were also lessons in fear. The glow of gas lamps couldn't keep out the shadows. Every corner held danger: rival gangs, drunk dock workers, cops who didn't care if an immigrant kid bled out on the curb. Lucky saw men beaten for $1, boys stabbed over a deck of cards, families torn apart because they owed the wrong man the wrong favor. The violence wasn't random. It was the language of survival, spoken fluently by those who refused to starve. Still, even in those grim shadows, Luciano found moments of quiet reflection. He'd walk alone after midnight, shoes scuffing against cobblestones slick with rain, watching the city shimmer under street lamps. He thought about the life his parents had imagined when they came from Sicily, a better future, a clean slate. But the truth was different. America was no promised land. It was another battleground, and only the sharpest claws carved out a place at the top. And so, even then, he began to plan. Not out loud. Not with bold declarations. That wasn't his way. No, Lucky's ambition was a whisper, subtle, careful, steady. He knew he'd never break free by working in sweatshops, never win respect by bowing to the old Sicilian codes of honor that kept men shackled in the past. He wanted something else. Something modern. Something American. On nights when the city's hum quieted just enough, Luciano would picture it, a network of power that didn't rely on brute force alone. A system where men could make money, control streets, and build something lasting. Even as a boy, he sensed that the old guard, the traditional mafia bosses still clinging to Sicilian ways, would eventually fall. And when they did, someone like him would be ready to take their place. But those thoughts, those grand schemes, stayed buried in the shadows of his mind. Outwardly, he was just another tough kid on the block running errands, getting into scraps, and carrying himself with the swagger of someone who refused to be stepped on. It was that balance, ambition tucked behind charm, violence hidden beneath calm, that set him apart from the beginning. The whispers of the underworld carried his name long before anyone realized it. Not Lucky Luciano, not yet. Just Salvatore. But the way he moved, the way he smiled, the way he calculated every step? It was only a matter of time before those whispers grew louder. And if the city of New York had learned anything, it was this: whispers always came before the storm. Before Lucky Luciano was the man pulling the strings, he was just another kid on Mulberry Street, hungry, desperate, and already learning the art of survival. Mulberry Street didn't look like much to the outsiders. To the bankers uptown, it was just another crowded artery in a neighborhood they'd rather forget. But to the kids who grew up there, it was a kingdom carved out of sweat and struggle. Pushcarts lined the sidewalks, selling everything from stale bread to bootleg cigars. Peddlers shouted in accents so thick you could hardly tell what language they were speaking. And overhead, laundry flapped in the wind like flags of surrender. For young Salvatore Lucania, this was the world, loud, restless, and merciless. Poverty pressed on every corner like a hand around the throat of every immigrant family. His father, Antonio, worked as a plasterer, his hands cracked and raw from days of hauling and mixing. His mother, Rosalia, juggled too many children and not enough food, always praying her son wouldn't get lost to the streets. But the streets had a way of calling boys louder than mothers ever could. Luciano wasn't alone in this. Italian kids, Jewish kids, Irish kids, all of them fought the same war, the war of survival. Jobs were scarce, wages laughable, and respect non-existent. Cops patrolled, but not to protect. They kept order for the rich, not for the immigrant poor. And in that vacuum of authority, gangs flourished. Every block had its crew, and every crew had its rules. Break them, and you paid in blood. It didn't take long for Luciano to figure out which side of the line he wanted to stand on. Work honest, and you broke your back for pennies. Step into the shadows, and you might get hurt, but you might also eat. To a hungry boy, that wasn't a hard choice. Still, Lucky wasn't reckless. He wasn't the type to swing fists without thinking. He understood early on that fists earned attention, but brains earned respect. So, while other boys bragged about how many punches they could take, Luciano was watching, calculating. He saw how older hustlers carried themselves, the tilt of a hat, the way they kept one hand free when shaking yours, the calm confidence in their voices. These weren't lessons in violence. They were lessons in presence. He started small, running errands, carrying packages, keeping watch on corners. A bag here, a message there. Nobody noticed the kid at first. But Luciano made sure they remembered him when the job was done. Reliable, quiet, always with that easy smile. He learned that people liked dealing with someone who looked like he had things under control. And control was a currency more valuable than any coin. Of course, the streets didn't hand out respect without testing you first. One night, on his way back from a corner job, Luciano was cornered by a pair of older boys, Irish kids from the next block over. They shoved him against a wall, demanded his money, laughed at his Sicilian accent. Luciano could have backed down. Most kids did. But instead, he stood tall, spit blood on the sidewalk, and swung back. He didn't win, not that night. But when he staggered home with a split lip and fire still burning in his eyes, the message was clear: Lucky Luciano wasn't the kind of boy who bowed. Word spread, as it always did. Soon, other boys began gravitating toward him. Not because he was the strongest, he wasn't. Not because he was the richest, far from it. But because he had that mix of defiance and charm, that strange magnetism that made people want to follow. It wasn't long before he had his own small crew running nickel-and-dime hustles across the block. Cigarettes, dice games, the occasional pickpocketing job, nothing grand, but enough to make his name echo in alleys. It was around this time that Luciano began to understand something important. Violence had its place, sure, but fear alone never built an empire. The real trick was loyalty. If a man trusted you, he'd bleed for you. If he feared you, he'd only obey until someone scarier came along. Luciano played that balance like a violin. He was tough when he had to be, soft when it suited him, always making the people around him feel like they were part of something bigger. And slowly, something was building. New York wasn't just Italian. It was a patchwork of immigrant worlds stacked on top of each other. The Irish had their saloons. The Jews had their shops and clubs. The Italians had their bakeries and fruit stands. And each group had its hustlers, its enforcers, its little kings. Most kids stuck to their own, safe, predictable. But not Lucky. He had an instinct that told him opportunity didn't care about nationality. Respect didn't have to stay inside the borders of Mulberry Street. That instinct led him to a boy named Meyer Lansky. Different background, different world. Luciano was Italian. Lansky was Jewish. But when they crossed paths, there was recognition not of ethnicity, but of ambition. Both were smart. Both were hungry. And both understood something their elders didn't: the future of crime wasn't about old country grudges. It was about money. But that moment, that bond, still lay just ahead. For now, Luciano sharpened himself on the grindstone of poverty, learning how far charm could carry a kid, how far toughness could push him, and how fragile trust could be in a world where every smile might hide a knife. Some nights, after a long day of hustling, Luciano would walk back through the tenement shadows, listening to the whispers of neighbors. Arguments about rent. Cries of hungry children. The weary silence of fathers too tired to speak. Those sounds dug into him deeper than any beating ever could. He swore to himself that he would never live and die like that. No, he would rise. Not just to escape poverty, but to bend it to his will. To turn the very system that crushed men into the foundation of his own power. And so, in the heart of Mulberry Street, among the poverty and prejudice, the boy began to transform. Salvatore Lucania was just another immigrant kid. But Lucky Luciano? He was already being born. The city didn't know it yet. The old mafia bosses didn't see it coming. But in the whispers of the Lower East Side, in the restless eyes of a boy too smart for his block, the seeds of power had already been planted. And seeds, given enough time, always grow into something bigger. Every street corner had a price, and every shadow hid a knife waiting to collect it. The Lower East Side wasn't just crowded, it was contested. Every block was a battlefield, every alleyway a border, every corner a throne waiting to be claimed. Boys barely old enough to shave walked with switchblades tucked in their belts and brass knuckles bulging in their pockets. The city was swelling with immigrants, each group carving out its own slice of turf, and when those slices overlapped, blood ran in the cracks between the cobblestones. Lucky Luciano grew up in the middle of it. And for a boy who dreamed bigger than most, the chaos was both a curse and an opportunity. On Mulberry Street, fights broke out over nothing: a spilled drink, a stolen wallet, a look held a second too long. But beneath the noise and fists was a deeper truth: these weren't random brawls. They were rehearsals for war. The Italians had their gangs, the Irish theirs, the Jews theirs, and none of them trusted each other. Respect wasn't asked for. It was enforced, with broken noses and bloodied shirts. Luciano didn't shy away. He stepped into that chaos with the same calm smile he always carried, as if the violence was just another part of the music of the city. He wasn't reckless, though. He didn't fight for pride the way some boys did. He fought with purpose, to make a point, to build a name, to show he wasn't someone to be dismissed. It was in those bloody streets that he started forging bonds with men who would one day become legends themselves. One of them was Meyer Lansky. Their first real test together wasn't a handshake deal or a clever scam, it was a street fight. A gang of bigger boys tried to muscle Luciano out of a dice game, and before he could swing, Lansky stepped in. The two fought back-to-back, fists flying, blood mixing on the pavement. They didn't win clean, but they didn't run either. And in that moment, they earned something more valuable than victory: respect. From then on, the two were inseparable. Luciano brought the charisma, the charm, the ability to make men feel like they were part of something greater. Lansky brought calculation, numbers, and a mind that treated money like a chessboard. Together, they were sharper than the rest, already thinking beyond alleys and corners, imagining what power could look like on a bigger scale. But before dreams could grow, there were still battles to fight. The 1910s and 1920s in New York were a crucible. Young gangs clashed with older mafia mustache Petes who still clung to Sicilian traditions. The Irish controlled much of the political muscle through cops and ward bosses. Jewish gangs controlled smuggling routes and gambling dens. Italians were still fighting to establish themselves as more than just another immigrant nuisance. And in that scramble, violence became the common language. Lucky learned to speak it fluently. Ambushes in dark alleys, chases across rooftops, bloody lessons carved into his skin. He was stabbed more than once, beaten half to death another time, and left with scars that told their own stories. But each time, he came back sharper, harder, more careful. Pain didn't scare him, it trained him. He also learned the value of appearances. A man could be half dead inside, but if he walked with his shoulders back, hat tilted just right, and a smile that never wavered, people thought twice before crossing him. Luciano mastered that look, the look of calm danger. He'd stroll into a room after a beating, bruises blooming on his face, and still carry himself like the man in charge. And slowly, he became exactly that. The whispers on the street changed. Boys stopped calling him Salvatore. They started calling him Lucky. Some said it was because he had a knack for surviving fights he should have lost. Others said it was because cops never seemed to catch him when they caught everyone else. The truth was simpler: Luciano made his own luck, through charm, through brains, through an instinct for when to fight and when to smile. The violence wasn't endless chaos. To Luciano, it was a ladder. Every fight survived was another rung climbed. Every rival beaten or outsmarted was another lesson learned. And as the blood in the alleyways dried, Luciano began to see the bigger picture. Street fights were small stakes. Territory wars were only the beginning. The real prize wasn't holding one corner of Mulberry Street, it was holding the whole city in the palm of his hand. But ambition doesn't silence danger. In fact, it attracts it. One night, Luciano and Lansky were cornered by a rival crew, older, meaner, armed with blades. The fight that followed wasn't glorious. It was fast, ugly, and brutal. Blood pooled in the gutter, shouts echoed off brick walls, and Lucky staggered home with slashes across his chest. Yet even as he lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, pain burning through him, one thought echoed in his head: this is the price. And I'll pay it as many times as it takes. The Lower East Side had a way of testing men until they either broke or became something harder than steel. Luciano chose the latter. He wasn't just surviving the blood in the alleyways, he was shaping himself in it, forging an identity that could stand against anyone. Irish, Jewish, Sicilian, it didn't matter. By the time Prohibition crept onto the horizon, Lucky Luciano was no longer just another tough kid. He was a name. A reputation. A leader of men who were beginning to believe he could take them farther than any corner fight ever would. The alleys were still red, the night still dangerous, but beneath the blood there was a pulse. A rhythm. A promise. The whispers of power were growing louder. And Lucky was listening. Some friendships are born in the smoke of gunfire, others in the quiet nod of respect. Lucky found both in Meyer Lansky. There are moments in life when the air feels different, when time seems to pause just long enough for destiny to step into the room. For Lucky Luciano, one of those moments happened not in a boardroom or a grand hall, but on the hard, dirty streets of Manhattan. It was the kind of encounter that didn't seem monumental at first, just two boys sizing each other up. But years later, when the underworld bent to their will, it would be remembered as the birth of a brotherhood that reshaped American crime forever. The story begins with a fight, as most things in those days did. Luciano was running a dice game with a few of his Mulberry Street boys when an older Irish crew decided they wanted in. It turned ugly fast, fists, knives, the kind of chaos that turned cobblestone slick with blood. Lucky stood his ground, but the numbers weren't in his favor. That's when a wiry Jewish kid, sharp-eyed and quick, stepped in. He fought not with size or rage, but with precision. Every punch landed where it counted, every move calculated. By the end, the Irish crew staggered off, and Luciano was left standing shoulder to shoulder with a stranger who fought like he'd been planning it his whole life. That boy's name was Meyer Lansky. At first glance, they couldn't have seemed more different. Luciano was all charm and swagger, a natural-born leader who could make people follow him with a smile. Lansky, on the other hand, was quiet, reserved, with a gaze that cut deeper than words ever could. Where Lucky commanded a room, Meyer studied it. Where Lucky relied on instinct, Meyer relied on calculation. And yet, as they shook hands for the first time, both of them felt it, the unspoken recognition of ambition. Over the weeks that followed, the bond grew. They weren't just running street hustles anymore. Together, they started to think bigger. Dice games became organized rackets. Pickpocketing gave way to bootleg cigars, stolen goods, and protection schemes. Luciano brought in the muscle, the manpower, the charisma to smooth over rough edges. Lansky handled the books, kept the numbers tight, and saw patterns where others only saw chaos. Lucky once said Meyer had a brain like a bank. And it was true. The kid could add up columns of numbers faster than most men could blink, and he understood profit margins before he ever saw a ledger. He wasn't interested in small wins, he was interested in building systems. Luciano saw that, respected it, and together they began to sketch out an idea that would one day become the foundation of organized crime: treat it like a business. But in those early days, it was still survival. The streets didn't care about clever ideas or sharp suits. They cared about who bled and who didn't. Luciano and Lansky proved themselves again and again, not just through violence but through strategy. They built alliances with other Jewish and Italian crews, breaking the old unwritten rule that gangs stuck to their own. Where other kids clung to their ethnic pride, Lucky and Meyer looked past it. To them, money didn't have a nationality. Respect didn't have a language. Power didn't care where your parents were born. It was a radical thought at the time, almost heretical in neighborhoods where grudges ran generations deep. But to Lucky and Meyer, it wasn't idealism, it was practicality. The streets were too dangerous to stand alone. Cross-ethnic partnerships weren't just bold, they were necessary. And little by little, that necessity turned into loyalty. Bugsy Siegel was one of the first to join them, fiery, reckless, and dangerous in ways that both thrilled and unnerved Luciano. Bugsy wasn't calm like Meyer or calculated like Lucky. He was a spark, unpredictable, sometimes uncontrollable, but undeniably useful when the job required blood on the ground. Together, the three began to form the nucleus of something greater, though none of them could see the full picture just yet. Their bond wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in smoky backrooms of pool halls, on rooftops after close calls, in whispered conversations while nursing bruises. They watched each other's backs, counted each other's money, and, more importantly, trusted each other's instincts. In a world where betrayal was as common as rain, trust was gold. And the trust between Luciano and Lansky was something rare, something unshakable. There were nights when Luciano would walk the streets with Meyer, the city humming around them, and talk about the future. He'd point to the bright lights uptown, the clubs where politicians drank, the hotels where fortunes were exchanged. "That's where we belong," Lucky would say, his voice calm but full of certainty. Asterisk, not scraping for pennies in alleys. Up there. Making real money. Running things the way they should be run. Meyer would nod, his mind already working out the numbers, the logistics, the structure. The vision wasn't just about wealth. It was about order. Lucky hated the chaos of endless gang wars, the waste of lives over petty grudges. He imagined a system where disputes could be settled like businessmen settling accounts. Where crime wasn't random but organized. Where the underworld had rules, structure, and longevity. Meyer understood immediately. Together, they weren't just dreaming of power, they were dreaming of building something that could outlast them both. But dreams had to wait. The streets still demanded blood. Rivals still lurked around corners. And every move toward growth came with a price. They fought, they bled, they buried friends, and they carried on. Because underneath it all, they knew something the others didn't, their partnership was more than survival. It was destiny. Luciano once reflected years later that meeting Lansky was the smartest move he ever made. He had charm, he had toughness, but Meyer gave him balance. Where Lucky might have rushed headlong, Meyer pulled him back. Where Meyer might have hesitated, Lucky pushed forward. They weren't just partners. They were opposites made whole, two sides of the same coin. And as Prohibition crept closer, bringing with it rivers of illegal liquor and oceans of opportunity, that coin was about to be flipped into the air. Together, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky would bet everything on it. And the city of New York, no, the entire country, would never be the same again. They thought banning booze would clean up America, but all it did was hand the keys of the kingdom to men like us. And believe me, we knew exactly how to use them. The year was 1920, and America was about to change forever. The politicians called it a noble experiment. The newspapers called it a moral crusade. But on the streets, where real life happened, they called it something else entirely, opportunity. When the government slammed the door on alcohol, it opened 100 back doors, all of them leading to the same thing: easy money, power, and chaos. For Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and their growing crew, it was like watching the heavens rain gold. Before Prohibition, making a living on the streets was a grind. Dice games, protection rackets, stolen goods, they paid the bills, but they didn't build empires. Liquor, though, liquor was different. America didn't just want booze. It craved it. The saloons, the clubs, the corner bars, they weren't just places to drink, they were the heartbeat of communities. Shut them down, and people would pay anything to get them back. Lucky and Meyer understood that faster than most. It began with smuggling. Canada became a lifeline, its distilleries pumping out whiskey that flowed south like an underground river. Smugglers ran boats across the Great Lakes, trucks across the borders, and sometimes even airplanes dropping cargo in remote fields. The risks were high: border patrols, rival gangs, the constant threat of hijacking. But the profits? They were unlike anything the streets had ever seen. Luciano didn't waste time. While the old-timers were still shaking their heads, wondering if Prohibition would stick, Lucky was already making deals. He used his charm to grease politicians, his muscle to secure supply lines, and his vision to see the bigger picture. Every neighborhood needed liquor, and every bottle was worth its weight in cash. But running booze wasn't just about brute force. It was about networks. That's where Lansky came in. Meyer built the numbers. He mapped out routes, calculated risks, balanced profits against costs. Where others guessed, Meyer knew. He figured out how much a shipment could be sold for before it even left Canada, how many cops needed paying off, and how much muscle had to be stationed at every point along the way. His brain turned chaos into order and order into profit. It didn't take long for Lucky and Meyer's small operation to grow. Speakeasies popped up everywhere, hidden basements, backrooms, even behind barbershops. Some were little more than shacks with a few bottles and a card table. Others were palaces of jazz and excess, dripping with glamour, velvet curtains, and the sweet sound of saxophones. The rich and the poor, the politicians and the gangsters, they all came to drink together. And behind every glass of gin or shot of whiskey, there was a man like Lucky Luciano pulling the strings. But Prohibition wasn't just about money. It was about power. Every bottle was a ticket to influence. Every shipment, a chance to expand. Rival gangs fought tooth and nail to control territories: Irish mobs, Italian crews, Jewish outfits, even crooked cops. Everyone wanted a piece. Streets turned into battlefields. Trucks were hijacked, warehouses burned, men shot down in alleys. The newspapers called it lawlessness. To Lucky, it was just the cost of doing business. The chaos had its uses. Luciano thrived in it. He was smart enough to avoid the petty wars, to see beyond the blood feuds that dragged others down. Instead, he built alliances. He cut deals with rival crews, shared profits, and carved out boundaries. Where others saw enemies, Lucky saw partners. It wasn't out of kindness, it was strategy. He knew that the real enemy wasn't the gang across town. It was the government, the law, the unpredictable storm of politics. If the gangs wasted their energy fighting each other, the feds would swoop in and shut them all down. But if they cooperated, if they treated crime like a business, they could thrive. This vision was radical at the time. Old bosses believed in tradition, in keeping to themselves, in fighting anyone who stepped on their turf. Lucky's idea of cooperation was almost heresy. But slowly, his way began to win out. Money has a way of silencing old grudges, and Prohibition was printing it faster than anyone could count. Still, nothing came easy. The law was everywhere. And while cops were easy enough to bribe, the feds were a different beast. Raids were constant, seizures common, and once in a while, a shipment worth thousands vanished into government warehouses. Luciano learned quickly that protection had to go higher. Local cops weren't enough. Judges, city officials, even senators, everyone had a price, and Lucky made sure he paid it. By the time most of New York woke up to what was happening, Luciano's network was untouchable. Of course, power came with danger. Not just from rivals, but from within. Greed had a way of rotting loyalty. Men who once swore blood oaths suddenly found reasons to skim a little off the top, to sell information, to try and carve out their own slice. Luciano dealt with it swiftly. Betrayal wasn't forgiven. Bodies started showing up in rivers, alleys, shallow graves. To Lucky, it wasn't cruelty. It was discipline. A business couldn't run on weakness, and he made sure everyone understood that. Meanwhile, the glamour of the era began to shine. Jazz clubs, flapper girls, sharp suits, fast cars. Prohibition didn't kill fun, it made it dangerous. And that only made it sweeter. The rich, who once scorned the street gangs, now rubbed shoulders with them in smoke-filled speakeasies. Politicians preached morality by day and drank bootleg whiskey by night. And behind the curtains, Luciano smiled, knowing every glass poured was another step toward empire. By the mid-1920s, Luciano was no longer just another street tough. He was a businessman. A kingpin. A man whose influence stretched from downtown dives to uptown mansions. Lansky stood beside him, the quiet strategist, while Bugsy Siegel and others handled the heat of the streets. Together, they weren't just surviving Prohibition. They were mastering it. And yet, beneath the surface, tension simmered. Old bosses resented Luciano's rise. Irish gangs plotted revenge. Federal agents tightened their grip. The more successful Luciano became, the more enemies he created. But Lucky didn't flinch. He saw what others didn't. Prohibition wasn't just a wave to ride. It was a flood that would wash away the old ways and leave behind something entirely new. He intended to be the man left standing when the waters receded. And so, in backrooms filled with smoke and whispers, in nights filled with gunfire and champagne, Lucky Luciano laid the foundations of an empire. Prohibition had given him the tools, but it was his vision that turned bootleg whiskey into power. What the government thought was a moral crusade became, in Luciano's hands, the golden flood. And he was ready to ride it all the way to the top. They called it a war, but it wasn't fought with flags and medals, it was fought in alleys, in whispers, in the shadows of New York. And every drop of blood spilled was a step toward the throne. By the late 1920s, New York was drowning in money. Prohibition had turned street gangs into empires. But with wealth came ambition, and with ambition came war. For decades, the Italian underworld had been split, its loyalties divided between the old Sicilian bosses who clung to tradition and the younger Americanized generation who craved power, efficiency, and business. Luciano stood at the crossroads of those worlds. He had the blood of Sicily in his veins, but the mind of America in his head. And when the storm finally broke, he knew he couldn't just survive it, he had to shape it. The war began quietly, as most do. A feud, a disagreement, a whisper of disrespect. But in the underworld, whispers grew into bullets faster than smoke rising from a gun barrel. At the center of it all was Joe the Boss Masuria, Luciano's mentor, patron, and master. Masuria was old-school Sicilian, suspicious, brutal, demanding loyalty like a king demanded tribute. He had built his empire on fear, and for a time, it worked. But by the late 1920s, cracks were showing. Across the East River, a rival rose to challenge him, Salvatore Maranzano, a Castellammarese from Sicily with the backing of a powerful network. Where Masuria ruled by brute force, Maranzano used cunning, tradition, and a cold-blooded patience that unsettled even his allies. His men were disciplined, fanatically loyal, and willing to bleed for his cause. To Maranzano, the underworld was not chaos to be exploited but a kingdom to be ruled. The stage was set for what would be remembered as the Castellammarese War. Luciano found himself caught in the middle. On one side stood Masuria, the man who had given him his first real foothold in power. On the other was Maranzano, promising order, structure, and a future built not on chaos but on strategy. Luciano played the part of loyal soldier, smiling at Masuria's table while quietly studying the moves of both camps. To him, this wasn't just survival, it was opportunity. The war itself was brutal. Streets once alive with jazz and whiskey turned into killing grounds. Drive-bys, ambushes, assassinations, New York ran red with the blood of mobsters whose names were forgotten as quickly as their bodies hit the ground. The newspapers fed the frenzy, calling it an epidemic of gangster violence. Politicians wrung their hands, police made arrests that led nowhere, and the public watched with a mixture of fear and fascination. For Luciano, the chaos was exhausting. He had no love for constant war, it bled money, drained men, and weakened everyone involved. Every day, he watched allies fall, businesses crumble, fortunes slip through blood-stained fingers. But behind his calm eyes, a plan was forming. If this war was tearing the old world apart, then maybe, just maybe, he could build something new from the ashes. Still, loyalty was a dangerous game. Masuria demanded it like a god demands sacrifice. He saw betrayal everywhere, and his paranoia grew with every lost man. Luciano played along, feeding his boss just enough devotion to keep suspicion at bay. But inside, he was restless. He saw the future in terms Masuria couldn't understand. To Lucky, the mob wasn't about Sicilian honor codes or endless vendettas, it was about business. Money didn't care about tradition. It didn't care where you were born or who your grandfather was. It only cared about power. And Luciano wanted power more than anything. The turning point came when the war dragged into its third year. Both sides were bleeding, exhausted, desperate for a decisive blow. Masuria tightened his grip, demanding more from Luciano and his allies while giving back less. Maranzano, on the other hand, dangled promises. He whispered of a future where the underworld could be organized, structured like the Roman legions, with himself as Caesar. To Luciano, both choices smelled of death. Stick with Masuria, and he'd be dragged down with a sinking ship. Side with Maranzano, and he'd simply be trading one master for another. But then came the idea, bold, dangerous, unthinkable. What if there were no masters at all? What if the old ways, the endless wars of Sicilian tradition, could be broken forever? What if crime could be run like a corporation, with families instead of feudal clans, with bosses who cooperated instead of slaughtered one another? Luciano didn't just want to survive the war. He wanted to end the cycle that created it. He began to make moves, carefully, quietly. Meyer Lansky remained his closest confidant, the calm strategist who could see the numbers behind the bloodshed. Bugsy Siegel, reckless and fearless, became his weapon in the streets. Together, they navigated the chaos, making sure Luciano's operations stayed afloat while others drowned. And all the while, Lucky spoke softly with Maranzano's men, planting seeds, building trust, and making sure that when the moment came, he would be on the winning side. The streets grew colder as the war reached its peak. Men lived day to day, never knowing if a bullet would find them on a walk home or a handshake would hide a knife. Luciano learned to sleep with one eye open, to trust no one fully, not even his closest allies. The paranoia was suffocating, the tension unbearable. And yet, in the quiet of the night, he dreamed of something bigger. Finally, the breaking point arrived. Masuria's empire was crumbling, his allies deserting him, his paranoia consuming him. Maranzano stood poised to take New York. But Luciano knew that simply trading crowns would do nothing. He needed to rewrite the rules entirely. He needed to remove both kings from the board. But that story, the betrayal, the bloody chess move that changed history, was still to come. For now, the streets of New York were locked in their deadliest war, a war that would shape the future of organized crime forever. Luciano, calm as ever, watched it unfold. He let the old men bleed, let them cling to their fading power while he sharpened his knives in the dark. He was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a loyal underboss. He was becoming something far more dangerous, a visionary with the patience to wait and the ruthlessness to strike when the time was right. The Castellamarese War would end as all wars do. But for lucky Luciano, it wasn't just about who won or lost. It was about what came after. Because once the dust settled, once the blood washed off the sidewalks, he planned to build something no one had ever dared imagine, an empire that would last. And as the city groaned under the weight of violence, as jazz bands played for crowds that drank and danced to forget the killings outside, Luciano whispered to himself a truth few could see: war wasn't just destruction. Sometimes, war was opportunity. And he intended to seize it. Every king falls. But sometimes it ain't the bullets from his enemies that take him down, sometimes it's the hand of the man sitting right beside him at dinner. The Castellamarese War dragged on like a sickness, eating away at the bones of New York's underworld. By 1931, the city was tired of the gunshots, the whispers, the endless blood in the gutters. Businesses faltered, alliances shifted, and trust became as rare as peace. At the center of this storm stood Joe the Boss Masuria, clutching to power like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Masuria had once been the undisputed king of the Sicilian gangs in New York. His very name made men tremble, and his word was law. But the war had revealed cracks in his armor. His paranoia grew by the day. Every man who walked into his presence was a suspect. Every smile might hide betrayal. He barked orders with desperation instead of confidence, and his soldiers, though still loyal to his money, began to wonder if their boss had lost his edge. Luciano watched this unravel with the calm patience of a chess master. Outwardly, he played the part of the dutiful lieutenant, nodding at Masuria's commands, carrying out his orders, swearing his loyalty like a son to a father. But inside, he was restless, calculating, and waiting. He had already decided that Masuria's reign could not last. The old Don's paranoia was poisoning their empire. Every day under his command was another day of weakness, another step closer to ruin. And Luciano was no man's victim. The betrayal began not with a gun, but with a conversation. Salvatore Maranzano, Masuria's great rival, sent out whispers through intermediaries. The war had cost both sides dearly, and he wanted to know where Luciano stood. Luciano, ever cautious, didn't leap into the arms of his enemy. But he listened. Maranzano promised something Masuria never could: structure, order, a unified underworld. More than that, he promised survival. "Help me," Maranzano's message implied, and not only will this war end, but you will have your place in the new world. Lucky knew what that meant. It meant choosing. Loyalty to a boss who had given him his start, or loyalty to the vision he carried in his heart, a vision of something bigger, cleaner, sharper than the bloody chaos around him. The choice was painful, but in Luciano's world, pain and survival went hand in hand. He had sworn loyalty to Masuria, yes, but loyalty was a currency, and Masuria's had devalued. The future belonged to those bold enough to take it. The plot unfolded with cold precision. Luciano knew Masuria trusted him more than most. He used that trust like a blade. Together with his closest allies, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and a small circle of men who saw the bigger picture, he mapped out the plan. It had to be quick, clean, decisive. One mistake, and they'd all be corpses in the gutter. The setting would be simple: a card game, a friendly meeting, the kind of gathering Joe the boss loved. He had grown up on cards, cigars, and good food, and Luciano knew he'd never say no to such a night. The trick was to make it ordinary, to lull Masuria's paranoia into sleep just long enough for the hammer to fall. The day came in April of 1931. Coney Island was buzzing with life, the salty air carrying laughter, music, and the smell of fried food. The streets were alive with families and tourists, a perfect backdrop of innocence for what was about to happen. Luciano led Masuria to Nuova Villa Tomorrow, a small Italian restaurant where the evening would play out. The boss was in good spirits, maybe sensing victory in the war, maybe just hungry for cards and wine. He smiled, he laughed, he relaxed. Luciano kept his own mask steady. Inside, he was ice. Every gesture, every word had to be perfect. The card game began, the clinking of glasses mingling with the sound of shuffling cards. For a while, it was just another night. Luciano excused himself, stepping outside for a moment of fresh air. Masuria didn't suspect a thing. Why would he? Lucky was his protégé, his golden boy. If betrayal lurked anywhere, surely it wouldn't come from the man he trusted most. But in the shadows outside, killers waited. Siegel, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis, names that would echo through mob history, stood ready. They were Luciano's insurance, his chosen blades for this cutthroat surgery. Inside, Masuria played his hand, unaware it would be his last. The moment the signal came, the room erupted. Shots cracked like thunder, shattering the peace of the card game. Masuria slumped over the table, cards still clutched in his lifeless fingers. A king felled not by his enemies, but by his own men. The reign of Joe the Boss ended not with ceremony, but with the cold efficiency of betrayal. The killers slipped away into the night, leaving behind the image that would become legend. Joe Masuria slouched at the table, playing cards with death itself. Luciano returned, calm and collected, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. In that moment, he was no longer just lucky. He was the man who had orchestrated the fall of a king. To some, it was treachery of the worst kind. To Luciano, it was survival, destiny, and the only way forward. The underworld trembled at the news. Masuria, the once untouchable boss, had been struck down by his own circle. To many, it was unthinkable. To others, it was inevitable. Luciano had sent a message clearer than any bullet: the old ways were over. And yet, he wasn't naive. He knew that with Masuria gone, the throne didn't sit empty. Maranzano now stood as the most powerful man in New York, perhaps in all of America. For a time, Luciano played the loyal lieutenant once again, smiling, nodding, swearing allegiance. But deep down, he knew Maranzano was just another king waiting to fall. The betrayal of Joe the Boss was more than an assassination. It was a shift in the very foundations of organized crime. Luciano had proved he was willing to do what others wouldn't. He had proved that loyalty was not sacred, that tradition could be broken, that the underworld could be remade in the image of those bold enough to take it. The streets buzzed with rumors. Who ordered the hit? Who fired the shots? Everyone whispered, but no one dared speak too loudly. Luciano's name was there between the lines, but he carried himself with such calm, such authority, that suspicion seemed dangerous. To accuse Lucky was to invite your own funeral. In the quiet aftermath, Luciano reflected not on guilt, but on opportunity. He didn't mourn Masuria. He didn't regret the betrayal. To him, it was necessary. Painful, yes. Risky, yes. But necessary. The underworld was no place for sentiment. Survival demanded sacrifice, and he had made his. As the city returned to its rhythm, as prohibition carried on and fortunes continued to rise, Luciano positioned himself for what came next. The war was ending, but the real battle was only beginning. Maranzano sat on the throne now, but Luciano had tasted power, and once tasted, it could never be forgotten. One king had fallen. another would rise. And lucky Luciano, calm as ever, was already planning how to bring the next one down. They called him Caesar. But like every Caesar before him, he forgot one thing: Rome always breeds new assassins. The gun smoke from Joe Masuria's death hadn't yet cleared before another name filled the void: Salvatore Maranzano. In the eyes of many, the Castellamarise War had ended the moment Masuria slumped over that card table in Coney Island. And when the dust settled, it was Maranzano who stood tallest, not because he was the smartest man in the room, but because he had survived. For years, Maranzano had been painted as the noble Sicilian, disciplined, old world, a man of tradition. His soldiers admired his sense of order, his sharp mind, his almost religious devotion to the ways of the Mafia as it had been practiced back in Sicily. To them, he was more than a boss, he was a general, a patriarch, a leader who could restore honor to the streets. But beneath that aura of respect lay something darker. Maranzano was ambitious, proud, and obsessed with control. He didn't just want to win the war. He wanted to remake the entire underworld in his image. When Masuria's body hit the floor, Maranzano wasted no time. He convened a grand meeting, calling together the bosses, the capos, the surviving lieutenants who had been bloodied by years of war. In a quiet Brooklyn house, the men of the Mafia gathered. The tension was thick: who would lead now, who would demand tribute, who would claim the spoils of war. Maranzano walked into that meeting like a Roman emperor entering his senate. Tall, confident, dressed in fine suits, he commanded the room not with fear but with authority. And when he spoke, it was with a voice that dripped with certainty. From this day forward, he declared, there will be 5 families in New York. 5, no more, no less. Each family will have its boss, its underboss, its consigliere, its captains, and its soldiers. Each will answer to me, and I alone will keep the peace. It was a radical vision, the first attempt to structure organized crime in America with the precision of a government. To the old Sicilians, it sounded like wisdom. To the young upstarts, it sounded like chains. Luciano listened quietly, hiding his true feelings. Outwardly, he gave Maranzano the respect he demanded. He nodded, shook hands, pledged loyalty. But inside, he recognized the danger. Maranzano wasn't building a republic of equals. He was building an empire with himself seated on the throne as Caesar. And Luciano knew one thing about Caesars: they never lasted forever. For a brief moment, though, Maranzano's rule seemed absolute. He reorganized territories, demanded tributes, and reminded everyone that the old Sicilian code was law. He railed against the Americanized gangsters, the Jews like Meyer Lansky, the Irish partners who had proven so vital to the bootlegging business. In his eyes, the underworld had to be pure, Sicilian, and above all, obedient. Luciano bristled at this. His vision was different. He saw the Mafia not as an exclusive club but as a corporation. To him, Lansky, Siegel, and the rest were not outsiders, they were partners, innovators, and necessary pieces of a larger machine. Maranzano's obsession with bloodlines and old-world rituals seemed not only outdated but dangerous. The cracks began to show almost immediately. Maranzano, paranoid by nature, grew suspicious of Luciano. He respected Lucky's intelligence, but he also feared it. He saw in Luciano the same cunning that had brought down Masuria. And in the back of his mind, Maranzano wondered, could this young upstart do the same to him? So he began plotting. Quietly, subtly, he reached out to loyal assassins. He spoke in whispers of eliminating Luciano before Luciano eliminated him. In the world of power, paranoia breeds prophecy. But Luciano was no fool. His network of spies and informants was vast, and word of Maranzano's plan found its way back to him. One evening over cigars and brandy, Lansky laid it out plainly, Salvatore wants you gone, Charlie. You know what that means. You strike first, or you don't strike at all. Luciano understood. Maranzano had styled himself as Caesar of the Underworld. And like Julius Caesar, he had surrounded himself with senators who smiled to his face but sharpened their knives in secret. Still, Luciano didn't rush. He was patient, deliberate. He weighed every option, every risk. Killing Masuria had been one thing, the old Don was already crumbling, his reign collapsing. But Maranzano was strong, organized, and dangerous. Striking him would shake the foundations of the entire mafia. In the end, Luciano knew there was no other way. Maranzano's vision and his own were incompatible. One of them had to go. For a brief season, however, Maranzano enjoyed his throne. He basked in the power of being called boss of bosses. He strutted through meetings, collected tributes, and demanded respect. He even carried himself like an emperor, speaking of history, of Rome, of empire. The men whispered behind his back, mocking his arrogance, but in front of him, they bowed. Maranzano believed his empire would last. But history, as always, had other plans. They thought the new Caesar would last forever, but in New York, forever only lasted 90 days. Salvatore Maranzano sat in his Midtown Manhattan office, the self-proclaimed Caesar of the Underworld, convinced that the empire he had built would endure. He carried himself with an air of invincibility, as though the Castellamarese War had crowned him eternal ruler of the 5 families. But outside those polished wooden doors, the whispers were already swirling. Whispers of discontent. Whispers of rebellion. And, most dangerously, whispers reaching the ears of one man who had never stopped calculating, Charlie Lucky Luciano. To Maranzano, Luciano was useful, young, intelligent, capable of enforcing order. But he was also dangerous, too clever, too ambitious. The same traits that made Luciano indispensable also made him a threat. So Maranzano decided to do what every insecure ruler does: eliminate the rival before the rival eliminates him. He began quietly. Trusted messengers carried coded instructions. A few loyal killers were promised fortune, honor, eternal respect if they removed Luciano from the picture. Maranzano believed his move was subtle. But subtlety was wasted when the streets were alive with spies. Luciano's network stretched across Italians, Jews, and even Irishmen, and the news reached him like a whisper in the dark: Maranzano wants you dead. One night, in a smoky suite above a Times Square club, Luciano sat with Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and a handful of trusted allies. The air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Nobody raised their voice, but every word carried the weight of life and death. "He's planning to take you out, Charlie," Lansky said, his calm, calculating voice slicing through the haze. He doesn't see you as a partner. He sees you as the next Joe the boss, a rival to be clipped before you get too strong. Luciano leaned back, his expression unreadable. He tapped ash from his cigarette, eyes narrowing in thought. Siegel, always quick to fire, pounded the table. So what are we waiting for? Let's hit him before he even breathes in your direction. Luciano raised a hand, silencing him. Bugsy, this ain't about speed. This is about precision. Maranzano's not some 2-bit street punk. He's careful. He's respected. If we go at him sloppy, we don't just risk our skins, we risk tearing this whole thing apart. The room fell into silence. Everyone knew the truth. Killing Maranzano wouldn't just be another hit, it would be a coup. The end of one era and the start of another. And Luciano, with his cool, patient demeanor, was willing to take that chance. For weeks, he planned. He studied Maranzano's movements, the office visits, the meetings, the bodyguards. He knew that Maranzano was paranoid, but predictable. The man worked out of a sleek office on Park Avenue, surrounded himself with books about Roman history, and preached about discipline while secretly drowning in fear. Luciano devised a plan that was as bold as it was unorthodox. Instead of relying solely on Italian button men, he would call on his allies, the Jewish gangsters who had proven their loyalty in blood. Meyer Lansky suggested it. Bugsy Siegel embraced it. And Luciano agreed. Maranzano would never suspect killers who didn't fit the mold. The day arrived, September 10, 1931. Maranzano sat in his office poring over documents, unaware that history was about to rewrite itself. Outside, the city bustled with its usual rhythm, taxis honking, newsboys shouting headlines, the hum of industry echoing through Manhattan. Inside the office, the silence was heavy, almost sacred, as if fate itself was holding its breath. Luciano didn't show up. Instead, 5 men walked through the doors. They weren't dressed like gangsters. They wore neat suits, carried briefcases, and looked every bit the federal agents they were pretending to be. Maranzano, suspicious but caught off guard, welcomed them in. He believed they were tax investigators, maybe even prohibition agents. Then the masks came off, not literal masks, but the illusion of authority. The briefcases snapped open, and out came pistols and knives. In that instant, Caesar realized the Senate had betrayed him. What happened next was swift, brutal, and final. The killers lunged, pinning Maranzano down. His cries echoed against the polished office walls, muffled by the sounds of fists and blades. They stabbed him repeatedly, gunfire cracking to ensure no mistake was made. Within moments, the self-proclaimed Caesar lay bleeding on the floor, his reign ended not by war, but by calculated betrayal. The message was clear: in the world of the Mafia, thrones were not inherited. They were stolen with blood. Outside, New York carried on, unaware that the power structure of its underworld had just shifted forever. Inside, Luciano's men wiped down their weapons, straightened their ties, and vanished back into the city like ghosts. When Luciano received the call that the job was done, he didn't celebrate. He didn't cheer or boast. He simply nodded, lit another cigarette, and muttered, "Now we can finally build." The fall of Maranzano marked more than the death of a man. It marked the death of the old ways, the rigid, Sicilian-dominated traditions that clashed with the new world. Luciano's strike wasn't just about survival. It was about evolution. He had removed the final obstacle to his vision, a syndicate, a modern corporation of crime where partnerships mattered more than bloodlines and profits spoke louder than old codes. And yet, the danger wasn't gone. Removing Maranzano was a gamble. His loyalists still lurked in the shadows. His allies still whispered of revenge. But Luciano understood something that Maranzano never did: power isn't about fear. It's about trust, about alliances, about building something bigger than yourself. In that sense, September 10th was not just a killing. It was a coronation. Luciano didn't call himself *boss of bosses. He hated the title. To him, it sounded foolish, arrogant, destined to attract bullets. Instead, he built something new: a commission, a table where equals sat, where disputes were settled with words instead of endless bloodshed. He believed it was the only way the Mafia could survive in America: by adapting, by thinking like businessmen, not butchers. But that would come later. For now, in the smoky nights of New York, the whispers grew louder: Maranzano is gone. Luciano did it. The kid just killed Caesar. And in every whisper, in every hushed voice, there was awe and fear. Because everyone knew what came next: the rise of Lucky Luciano, not as a soldier, not as an underboss, but as the architect of a new underworld. Maranzano's reign had lasted barely 3 months. Caesar had fallen. And in his place, a new kind of ruler was about to emerge. They killed the old king, but Lucky didn't take the throne. Instead, he built a round table. After the blood dried in Maranzano's Park Avenue office, the city didn't pause to mourn. Taxis still honked, Wall Street still roared, and newsboys still shouted headlines about Hoover and politics, not about the Caesar who had just been stabbed to death. On the surface, New York remained the same. But in the underworld, everything had shifted. The old guard was gone. The crown lay on the ground. And for the first time in mafia history, there was no single man demanding to wear it. Lucky Luciano understood the danger of power. He had seen how Joe Masuria's arrogance had dragged everyone into war. He had watched Maranzano crown himself boss of bosses, only to be cut down in 90 days. Lucky knew if he tried the same stunt, he would be dead within a year. So he did something no mafia leader had ever dared: he refused the throne. Instead, he envisioned something new. Something radical. Something built not on Sicilian tradition, but on American practicality. If the mafia wanted to survive in the modern world, it couldn't act like a feudal kingdom with one tyrant at the top. It had to function like a corporation, streamlined, efficient, stable. And at the heart of that corporation would be a governing board, the commission. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of one man dictating, each family would have a voice. Disputes would be brought to the table instead of spilling blood in the streets. Territory would be negotiated instead of fought over. The mafia would no longer operate like a group of tribal clans at war, but like a syndicate, a business. Luciano didn't waste time. Within weeks of Maranzano's death, he summoned the heads of the major families. The meeting was discreet, hosted in a quiet hotel suite away from the prying eyes of police and reporters. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. These were men who had fought against one another, who had spilled each other's blood. The war was still fresh in their memories. But Luciano spoke with calm authority, his voice smooth, persuasive, almost hypnotic. "We can't keep running this thing like a circus," he said, cigarette smoke curling around his words. "We kill each other, the cops get wise, the papers get wild, and in the end, we all lose. That ain't business. That's suicide." Some heads nodded. Others crossed their arms, suspicious. Luciano leaned forward, his dark eyes steady. "What I'm proposing is simple. No more boss of bosses. That title only brings bullets. Instead, we set up a commission. Each of us, the big families, we get a seat. We vote on disputes. We split territory fair. We act like businessmen, not peasants stabbing each other in the dark. That's how we make real money. That's how we survive." Silence followed. The old guard, the Sicilian purists, bristled at the idea of breaking tradition. But others, tired of endless wars, recognized the brilliance. Meyer Lansky, always by Luciano's side, nodded approvingly. He knew Charlie's words weren't just about peace. They were about control. By creating a table, Luciano would sit at the center of it. Finally, the room began to shift. One by one, the bosses agreed. They were tired of the chaos. They wanted stability. They wanted profit. And Luciano was offering both. The 5 families of New York were officially recognized: the Luciano family, later Genovese; the Mangano family, later Gambino; the Gagliano family, later Lucchese; the Prophesai family, later Colombo; and the Maranzano remnants reorganized under new leadership, later Bonanno. Each would have a seat on the commission, equal in voice, bound by a new code of cooperation. But Luciano's vision extended beyond New York. He opened the commission to other powerful bosses across America, from Chicago, where Al Capone's organization still loomed, to Cleveland, Buffalo, Detroit, and New Orleans. For the first time, the mafia wasn't just a local gang problem. It was a national syndicate, united under one structure. This was more than crime. This was politics. This was empire building. The commission operated in secrecy, meeting only when necessary, often under the guise of legitimate business conferences. They set rules: no killing another boss without commission approval. No declaring war without a vote. No breaking agreements once made. The penalty for disobedience was swift and final: death. And it worked. Violence decreased. Profits soared. Gambling, loan sharking, narcotics, labor racketeering all flourished under the new order. The mafia became less of a shadowy street force and more of a corporate entity hidden in plain sight. Luciano didn't stop there. He expanded alliances beyond Italians. The Jewish syndicate, led by Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, was given permanent partnership. Irish mobs were tolerated if they played by the rules. Luciano's underworld wasn't about ethnicity. It was about money. Whoever could earn could belong. Reporters would later describe it as a criminal United Nations, a shadow government running parallel to America itself. Judges, politicians, cops all were quietly bought, bribed, or controlled. The commission made sure of it. But while Luciano preached equality, he was no fool. He was the architect, the visionary, the silent leader behind it all. His voice carried weight that no other boss could rival. He didn't need the title boss of bosses, his influence spoke louder than any crown. Still, danger lingered. Old traditions don't die quietly. Some Sicilian purists resented the erosion of their codes. Some bosses grumbled that Luciano was too friendly with Jews, too Americanized, too businesslike. Yet none dared challenge him openly. They remembered what had happened to Maranzano. And so, the commission became law. Its first years were a test of discipline. Disputes arose about unions, about gambling territories, about drug shipments slipping through ports. Each time, Luciano enforced the rules. Sometimes it meant negotiation. Sometimes it meant a discreet body on the pavement. But always, the system held. Under Luciano, the Mafia transformed from a chaotic patchwork of gangs into a streamlined syndicate with national reach. Fortune magazine would later estimate its revenues in the hundreds of millions. Politicians whispered of shadow rulers they could never name. Federal agents fumed at an enemy they couldn't define. Lucky Luciano had done the impossible. He had taken the Mafia, a scattered collection of violent men, and turned it into America's most powerful secret corporation. But power has a way of attracting attention. And while the streets grew quiet and the commission kept the peace, other eyes were watching. Eyes in Washington. Eyes in law enforcement. Eyes that would one day bring Lucky Luciano himself to trial. For now, though, in the dimly lit rooms of New York, a new order reigned. Not the rule of kings. Not the chaos of war. But the order of a council, a commission, a boardroom of killers who acted like executives. And at the center, always calm, always calculating, sat Lucky Luciano, the man who killed the boss of bosses by refusing to become one. They called it organized crime. But in those years, it looked less like crime and more like America's most profitable business. By the mid-1930s, the Mafia in America was no longer a loose collection of violent cliques clawing for scraps of power, it was an empire. The commission had turned chaos into order, war into profit, and ambition into a corporate structure that could rival any Wall Street conglomerate. And at the center of it all was Lucky Luciano, the quiet architect of a new underworld. These were the golden years. Years when the syndicate seemed untouchable, when every racket hummed like a well-oiled machine, when money poured in faster than it could be laundered. For Luciano and his allies, it wasn't just about gambling dens and bootleg liquor anymore. It was about labor unions, construction contracts, movie studios, nightclubs, and politicians. If there was money to be made in America, chances are some part of it flowed back to the commission. The foundation of this new wealth came from unions. Control the unions, and you controlled the docks, the trucks, the construction crews, the garment factories. You could shake down employers, siphon dues, manipulate strikes, and skim off contracts. From the longshoremen on the New York docks to the teamsters on the highways, the syndicate planted its claws deep into the backbone of American labor. Luciano saw unions not just as a way to make money but as a shield. A labor dispute could be staged to pressure a company. A strike could be ended with a handshake if the right envelopes were exchanged. Judges and politicians were forced to play ball because behind every picket line and protest sign stood the quiet power of organized crime. Then there were the nightclubs. In the smoky, neon-lit rooms of Manhattan, entertainers dazzled the crowds while mafia-backed investors skimmed off the profits. Singers, comedians, and dancers unknowingly performed under the watchful eye of mob enforcers who collected envelopes in the back. For many performers, paying a cut was just the cost of staying in business. For the Mafia, the clubs were more than money, they were a pipeline into show business, into Hollywood, into the heart of American culture. And gambling, always gambling. From backroom craps games in the Bronx to high-roller casinos in Miami, the syndicate expanded the gambling racket until it seemed endless. Bookmakers took bets on horse races, boxing matches, baseball games. Casinos operated in plain sight, guarded not by security cameras but by cops on the payroll. Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky were already whispering about a desert in Nevada, a place called Las Vegas, where one day the Mafia would build its biggest playground. It wasn't just New York, either. The Commission's reach stretched across the nation. In Chicago, Al Capone's old empire had been reshaped into the Chicago outfit, aligned with Luciano's national syndicate. In Detroit, the Purple Gang ran liquor and gambling with Commission approval. In Cleveland, Buffalo, Philadelphia, New Orleans, everywhere there was money, there was a boss tied to the Commission's web. Luciano's genius wasn't just organization. It was diplomacy. He kept the peace between powerful men who otherwise might have torn each other apart. He reminded them that war was bad for business and business was what mattered. Under his guidance, disputes were settled with votes, not bullets. If a killing had to be done, it was done clean, approved, and invisible. The newspapers stopped screaming about gangland massacres. To the public, it looked like the Mafia had vanished. In reality, it had never been stronger. Behind the curtain, politicians fell into line. Luciano and Lansky mastered the art of bribery. Judges suddenly looked the other way. Police captains turned their backs at the right moment. Senators and congressmen received quiet campaign donations, never asking where the money came from. Even the governor's mansion wasn't beyond reach. It was during these years that the Mafia perfected its role as a hidden hand in American life. Strike a deal with the Commission and you could make millions. Cross them, and your business could collapse overnight. Most chose the deal. Luciano's personal life reflected the duality of his world. To outsiders, he was a handsome, stylish figure, always impeccably dressed, always calm, his scarred face softened by charm and wit. He dined at the finest restaurants, escorted beautiful women, mingled with entertainers and politicians alike. To insiders, he was a calculating strategist, a man who could smile at you one night and sign your death warrant the next. Meyer Lansky was his brain. Bugsy Siegel, his muscle. Frank Costello, his diplomat. Together, they formed a circle of influence that extended far beyond New York's 5 families. This inner circle didn't just run rackets, they dreamed bigger. They saw the Mafia not as a street gang, but as a multinational enterprise. Meanwhile, America itself was shifting. The Great Depression had left millions struggling, and the government seemed powerless to fix it. In that void, the Mafia thrived. While Wall Street crumbled, the syndicate flourished. Liquor, gambling, loans, people always needed them, especially when times were hard. By the time Roosevelt's New Deal started to stabilize the economy, Luciano's empire was already entrenched in the very industries meant to rebuild America. And yet, for all the power and wealth, there was always danger. Federal investigators, though often hampered by corruption, never stopped watching. District attorneys whispered about organized crime, even if they couldn't prove it. Newspapers occasionally ran exposés on the Mafia, though never naming names. Luciano understood the risk. He knew that the higher he climbed, the further he had to fall. Still, in those golden years, the Mafia felt unstoppable. There were no more bloody headlines about massacres, no more public shootouts. Instead, there were smiling politicians, booming nightclubs, bustling docks, all humming under the silent rhythm of the Commission. It was empire without ceremony. Power without a crown. The Mafia was invisible, yet everywhere. Its fingerprints were on paychecks, on contracts, on neon signs, on movie screens. It was in the laughter of nightclubs, in the sweat of the docks, in the whispers of backroom deals. And through it all, Lucky Luciano reigned, not as a king, but as the quiet chairman of a boardroom that had no walls. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to show force. His authority was woven into the very structure of the underworld. He had created something bigger than himself, something that would outlive him, the modern American Mafia. But golden years don't last forever. Success breeds envy. Power attracts enemies. And as Luciano enjoyed the fruits of his creation, others were plotting his downfall. Some enemies came from within: jealous bosses, old-world traditionalists, men who resented his American ways. Others came from the outside: lawmen, prosecutors, ambitious politicians who dreamed of making their careers by bringing down the most powerful gangster in America. For now, though, the golden years belonged to him. New York glittered with opportunity. The commission sat strong. The syndicate stretched from coast to coast. Money flowed like wine. And in the smoky silence of private meetings, Lucky Luciano allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had taken a world of chaos and carved it into order. He had turned crime into industry. He had created a kingdom without a crown, a government without a name, a corporation that didn't exist on paper but ruled in reality. The newspapers called it organized crime. Luciano called it business. And in those golden years, business was good. Every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually meets its reckoning. For Lucky Luciano, the man who built the mafia into a corporate empire, the fall would come not from bullets in the street but from the courtroom. By the late 1930s, Lucky Luciano had reached the peak of his influence. His commission had transformed the mafia into an invisible empire, its tentacles wrapped around labor unions, gambling halls, nightclubs, and Hollywood studios. He dined with politicians, mingled with stars, and moved through the city like a shadow king. But in America, no one stays untouchable forever. And for Luciano, the reckoning came from an enemy he had underestimated: the law. The man who would become Luciano's greatest foe was Thomas E. Dewey, a sharp, ambitious prosecutor with a reputation for being fearless. Dewey wasn't just another district attorney, he was a man on a mission, a crusader against organized crime. Where others turned away, Dewey charged head-on. He had already taken down bootleggers and racketeers, and now his eyes fixed on the biggest target of all, Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano had always been careful. He avoided headlines, stayed out of the spotlight, and let others do the dirty work. He knew the power of invisibility. But no matter how careful he was, Dewey was relentless. He understood something most lawmen didn't: if you couldn't catch a mobster on murder, you caught him on business. And Dewey had discovered a trail that led to Luciano, a racket that no one had expected: prostitution. In New York, prostitution had always existed on the margins, tolerated by cops and politicians in exchange for envelopes of cash. But Dewey's investigators uncovered something deeper: an organized system that linked hundreds of brothels across the city, each paying tribute to a higher authority. That authority, they claimed, was none other than Lucky Luciano. The evidence was thin, but Dewey was smart. He didn't need photographs or wiretaps, he needed witnesses. And so he turned to the most vulnerable people in the racket, the prostitutes themselves. Under threat of prison, some agreed to testify. They painted a picture of a vast syndicate, one that connected madams, pimps, and mobsters in a chain of control that ended at Luciano's door. Luciano, of course, denied it all. He laughed at the charges. Prostitution? It was beneath him, he claimed. A man of his power didn't waste time on brothels. His empire was built on unions and gambling, not petty vice. To his peers, it seemed impossible that such a giant could fall because of something so small. But Dewey wasn't interested in appearances. He wanted a conviction, and he was determined to get it. In 1936, Dewey struck. Luciano was arrested in a dramatic sweep, accused of being the mastermind behind New York's prostitution ring. The newspapers exploded with headlines. For the first time, Luciano's name was dragged out of the shadows and plastered across the front page. The public, already fascinated by crime bosses, now had a new villain to watch. The trial that followed was a spectacle. Dewey stood in the courtroom like a warrior, his voice sharp, his arguments precise. Witness after witness took the stand, pointing fingers at Luciano. Prostitutes described how money flowed upward, how protection was bought with fear, how the chain of power always led to him. Defense attorneys argued that it was all lies, desperate stories told by women seeking leniency. But Dewey's momentum was unstoppable. The jury didn't see a businessman. They saw a gangster. They saw the face of organized crime, the man the newspapers called the most dangerous criminal in America. And when the verdict came, it shook the underworld, guilty. Lucky Luciano, the architect of the modern mafia, was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Others gasped. Luciano himself sat stone-faced, refusing to give Dewey the satisfaction of seeing him break. But inside, he knew the truth: his empire had been cracked wide open. For the mafia, the fall of Luciano was a seismic shift. The commission had lost its chairman, the man who had kept order, who had balanced power and profit, was now locked away. But the syndicate was too big to collapse. Men like Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Vito Genovese moved to fill the void, keeping the machine running while Luciano sat behind bars. Prison was a new world for Luciano. Gone were the silk suits, the fine restaurants, the glamorous nights. In their place were iron bars, harsh guards, and endless monotony. Yet even inside, his influence remained. Guards were bribed, privileges secured. Luciano lived better than most inmates, but it was still a cage, and for a man who had once ruled New York, the humiliation cut deep. Outside, Dewey rode his victory to political glory. He became a hero, a crime buster, a man of integrity in a world of corruption. His prosecution of Luciano cemented his reputation and launched his career toward the governorship. For Dewey, Luciano wasn't just a gangster, he was a stepping stone to power. But history has a way of twisting paths. Because while Luciano sat in prison, the world was shifting. By the early 1940s, America was at war. German submarines prowled the Atlantic, threatening to choke off supplies to the Allies. And in New York, the docks, controlled by the mafia, were vital to the war effort. The government needed help securing the waterfront, and suddenly the man they had locked away became useful again. Through secret arrangements, Luciano struck a deal with the U.S. government. In exchange for cooperation with naval intelligence and promises to keep the docks free of sabotage, he would receive favorable treatment. Some say his contacts even extended overseas, aiding the Allied invasion of Sicily. Whatever the full truth, the fact remained: the government had turned to a gangster for help in a time of war. By 1946, the deal bore fruit. Luciano's sentence was commuted, but with a catch: he would be deported to Italy, never to return to the United States. It was a bittersweet freedom. He walked out of prison, yes, but he walked into exile. For Luciano, the fall wasn't just prison. It was exile from the empire he had built. He had dreamed of ruling the underworld like a corporate titan, but now he was cut off, watching from afar as others reaped the rewards of his creation. From Naples and later Rome, he tried to exert influence, but distance made him weaker. The throne he had built no longer belonged to him. The irony was cruel. He had survived assassins, gang wars, and betrayals. He had outmaneuvered rivals and built the greatest criminal empire America had ever seen. But in the end, he was undone not by bullets, but by testimony in a courtroom. His power had been broken by words, not guns. And yet, even in exile, Luciano remained a legend. To the men who inherited his system, he was the father of the modern mafia, the man who showed them how to turn crime into business. To law enforcement, he was proof that no one, not even the most careful gangster, was untouchable. The golden years were over. The empire still stood, but its architect had fallen. And for Lucky Luciano, the downward spiral had only just begun. Because exile was not peace. It was a stage set for the final acts of his life, acts filled with betrayal, regret, and the lingering shadow of the empire he could never truly reclaim. They thought exile would end his reign. But for Lucky Luciano, deportation wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a new chapter. In 1946, when Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship that carried him from New York to Naples, he was a free man, but not a triumphant one. His freedom came with chains, invisible but heavy. He could never return to the United States, the land where he had built his empire, the city where his name had meant power whispered in every corner. Now he was in exile, stripped of his throne, standing in a country he had left as a boy. Italy welcomed him cautiously. To the authorities, he was a dangerous criminal, a man deported as a plague upon American soil. To the underworld, however, his arrival stirred excitement. Sicily had always been the birthplace of the Mafia, its traditions older than America's experiment in organized crime. And now the man who had reorganized the American Mafia stood among them. For some, he was a hero returning to his roots. For others, he was an outsider, too Americanized, too far removed from the codes of the old country. Luciano himself understood the delicate position he was in. He wasn't a king here. He was a guest, and one watched closely by both police and mobsters. His every move was shadowed by informants, his meetings tracked by suspicious officials. Yet even in exile, Luciano's mind was restless. Power wasn't something he could abandon. He had built a machine in America, and he refused to watch it run without him. Through letters, couriers, and secret emissaries, Luciano reached across the ocean. Men like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky still operated in New York and Havana, and Luciano wanted them to remember who had built their foundation. He sent advice, issued quiet instructions, and reminded them that though he was far away, his voice still mattered. But distance is a poison in the underworld. Messages were delayed, words twisted, and rivalries exploited. Luciano's influence began to waver, and in the shadows, men like Vito Genovese sought to claim the throne for themselves. Sicily, however, offered new opportunities. In the aftermath of World War II, the island was a place of chaos and hunger. Cities lay in ruins, black markets thrived, and the Mafia reasserted itself as the true power in villages and towns. American troops had relied on Mafia figures for intelligence and stability during the Allied invasion, and now those same figures were stronger than ever. Luciano, with his reputation and connections, found himself at the center of a network that stretched from Naples to Palermo. It was here that he began to see the future of crime shifting. The old rackets, gambling, extortion, even bootlegging, were fading. But a new product was emerging, one with profit margins greater than anything before: heroin. Sicily's position as a crossroads made it ideal for trafficking. The raw opium came from the Middle East and Turkey, passed through laboratories in Marseille, and from there it needed channels to the United States. Luciano, even in exile, still had the channels. He became a quiet architect of this trade, linking Sicilian suppliers with American distributors. His name carried weight, his approval acted as a guarantee. The drug pipeline that would later dominate the Mafia's empire in the 1950s and 60s had its seeds in these early connections forged by Luciano from exile. But Luciano's exile was not just business, it was also a personal struggle, a battle with isolation. Naples was not New York. The nights were quieter, the people poorer, the glamour absent. Luciano longed for the neon lights of Times Square, the jazz clubs of Harlem, the smoky backrooms where decisions shaped empires. Instead, he walked cobblestone streets under the watchful eyes of police, his every step recorded in government files. Still, his legend grew. To young Sicilian mafiosi, he was the living symbol of what was possible. He had turned the Mafia into an empire, had stood against lawmen and prosecutors, had made millions from the shadows. They flocked to him seeking advice as validation, a connection to the American dream of power. Luciano received them like a teacher, but behind the smiles, he felt the sting of reality. He was no longer in command. One of his attempts to reclaim power came through Havana. In the late 1940s, Havana was becoming a paradise for the underworld. Casinos, nightclubs, and hotels were booming, fueled by American tourism and Cuban corruption. Lansky had planted deep roots there, turning the city into a playground for mobsters and millionaires. Luciano saw an opening. If he could re-establish himself in Havana, he could be close to the United States without setting foot on its soil. In 1946, he traveled to Havana in secret, using false documents and bribed officials. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Luciano might reclaim his seat at the table. Mob bosses from across America gathered in Havana, honoring him as the founder, the father, the man who had built the syndicate. Plans were made, deals discussed, and Luciano's hand seemed once again to guide the empire. But the celebration was short-lived. U.S. authorities pressured Cuba, demanding Luciano's removal. They feared his presence so close to American shores, worried that his influence would spark a resurgence of organized crime. Within months, Luciano was forced out, deported back to Italy. The exile had doubled. Now even his chance to orbit America was gone. Back in Naples, the walls closed in further. The Italian police harassed him, raided his home, monitored his calls. American intelligence kept watch too, fearing his role in the heroin pipeline. Luciano became a man surrounded, respected by criminals but caged by governments. His frustration deepened. The empire he had built continued to thrive, but its architect was reduced to whispers from afar. Still, Luciano adapted. He leaned harder into the heroin trade, ensuring the Sicilian-American connection remained alive. Couriers smuggled shipments in clever ways, hidden in food crates, sewn into clothing, passed through diplomatic channels. The profits were immense, and though Luciano never regained absolute control, his fingerprints were all over the traffic. Yet with every year, exile wore him down. He aged faster than he expected, his health declined, and his once iron will began to bend under the weight of solitude. The men who had once been his equals now ran the empire without him, their loyalty more symbolic than practical. He was still Lucky Luciano, still the legend, but no longer the king. In Sicily, whispers spread of his discontent. Some said he dreamed of returning to New York, even knowing it was impossible. Others claimed he plotted revenge against those who had abandoned him. But in truth, Luciano's greatest enemy was time. The world of the Mafia was evolving, and he was becoming a relic. His exile became a paradox, respected yet powerless, connected yet isolated. He had forged the link between the Sicilian Mafia and the American Mafia, creating a transatlantic bridge that would shape organized crime for decades. But personally, he was adrift, a ghost haunting a world he had once ruled. And so Luciano's Sicilian years were both triumphant and tragic. Triumphant because they solidified his role as the architect of a global underworld network. Tragic because they underscored his decline, a man watching his empire thrive while he himself withered in exile. For Lucky Luciano, exile was not an ending. It was a limbo, a suspended state where past glory collided with present powerlessness. He was neither fully gone nor fully present, a man whose name still echoed, but whose voice carried less weight with each passing year. The Sicilian connection he nurtured would outlive him, fueling the heroin epidemic, empowering new generations of mobsters, and binding America's mafia to its Sicilian roots. But for Luciano himself, the connection was bittersweet, proof that his vision endured, even as his personal reign faded into shadows. The king had built his empire. The king had been exiled. And now, in Sicily, the king waited restless for the final act of his story.